Good evening, everybody. My name is Jeremy Travis. I am privileged to be the president of John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you here. I'll take that on behalf of the college, thanks. Delighted to have all of you here this evening for this very important forum. We're pleased to host events like this because we consider ourselves to be a place where people come together to talk about difficult issues, to talk about them in a way that's constructive so that we can come together with some solutions on how to do things better in our world. And we call ourselves here at John Jay fierce advocates for justice. Our students, our faculty, administration, myself, we all think of ourselves as advocates for justice. And it's that spirit, it's in that spirit that I welcome you here tonight on this topic. So I've spent a good part of my life thinking about gun violence and violence generally, and domestic violence, sexual assault, and related topics. And I'm pleased to see that John Jay has become a place where people who share those interests can come together to come to grips with some of the underlying issues here and hopefully come up with some ideas, constructive ideas. We're delighted to be hosting this event in the sense that we're hosting it here, but also to be partnering with some of our friends in government, including Commissioner Rose Pierre-Louis from the Office of Domestic Violence of the Mayor's Office, our borough president, who I'll introduce in a second, Gail Brewer, the New Yorkers Against Gun Violence, Leah Gunn Barrett, who is here, and I'm very pleased to see Assembly Member Amy Paulin here as well. And finally, yes, Edward Hill, who's also in the Mayor's Office of Combat Domestic Violence. What you are privileged to have tonight is a combination of some of the people who are doing the most thoughtful and progressive strategizing around these issues, all here in one place. And I see microphones set up at the front of the auditorium, at the theater, so that you can also make your voices heard. So I promise you a good night. I wish I could stay and be with you for it, but I have to run off and do something else. That's my loss, because I think you'll have a very productive time together. My very welcome task is to next introduce to you your next speaker, who's the Borough President of Manhattan, Gail Brewer, who's well known to all of us here in this part of Manhattan. She was our council member for many years, then got elected with a stunning electoral result as our borough president, and has been serving in that office with great distinction. I think one of the best public servants in New York City, actually. Gail and I, our lives have intersected for many years. We were in the Dinkins City Hall together, and she is just a fierce advocate for the city and for Manhattan and for this district, for women and for violence reduction. So I can't imagine anybody better to be the first speaker tonight than our borough president, Gail Brewer. Please join me in welcoming Gail Brewer. Is that short enough?
Thank you very much. I am honored to be here, and I want to thank President Travis. I want to thank John Jay College, New Yorkers Against Gun Violence, and Connect for a lot of dedicated work to reduce gun violence and domestic violence in our city and state. And there's so many connections. I just came from LaGuardia High School, where with the renowned defense attorney, Gerald Lefcourt, we just sat and talked with about 50 LaGuardia students, because they're all understandably very upset about the situation in Staten Island and the outcome, having watched that horrible situation on video over and over again with Mr. Garner. So I think there is a relationship between that situation, police-community relations, and what you're talking about here tonight. But the positive in all of this is John Jay College has been a strong and steadfast ally in finding ways to make our policing efforts more equitable and effective and our streets safer. I think you'll see on television often experts from this amazing campus, students included, having their words discussed. So New Yorkers Against Gun Violence, launched over 2 decades ago by Brooklyn Mothers, it does advocate at the local and national level for legislation to protect our state and city residents, particularly youth and women, from gun violence. It also offers terrific after-school programs for students in all of our neighborhoods where there is gun violence. And connect, and you'll get a chance to meet Quentin Walcott, who's one of the few men, to be honest with you, who has been committed to anti-gun, finding ways to make domestic violence a thing of the past, working with men. He's really special, and I know he's going to be here today. Connect is an organization that he's part of, and I know others from Connect will be here. So what John Jay and these two great organizations share is a focus on prevention, prevention, prevention. How we can stop the next domestic violence incident from happening and how we can keep guns out of the picture. Again, it's very much a part of our discussion in the last few weeks. The state's domestic violence fatalities are frequently the result of a gun crime. Of the 665 domestic violence homicides in New York State between 2003 and 2012, 30.5% of the victims were killed with a gun. From 2003 to 2012, 34.5% of female domestic violence homicide victims in New York State were killed with a gun. And firearms accounted for the murders of 569 New York State women from 2002 to 2011. According to the state, in 2013, intimate partner homicides in our state increased 16%, going from 75 in 2012 to 87. Half of these women murdered in New York State are killed by their intimate partner. I think we know that, and the issue is, what do we do about it? What kind of transparency? What can we do about even police relations in this situation, and how can we make the system more accountable, everybody in it? And I think we see that there's a discussion also of the fact that black females in the United States were murdered at a rate nearly 2.5 times higher than white females in 2012. And this analysis also found that black women were most often killed by males in the course of an argument, most commonly with a gun. And these figures show that although New York City has seen a steep decline in homicides over previous years, which we should be proud of, we still have the menace of gun violence stalking our neighborhoods, and we know that only too well. So this panel, this tonight, is a great opportunity to hear from not just experts, but people who live this issue. People who are an advocate, government, academia, what works, what doesn't, and to learn about the legislation that could curtail this. I also want to give a shout out to Francesca, who is my former Borough President Ruth Messinger's granddaughter. So yay, Francesca, for being here tonight. I'm very excited. So because there is so much focus on legislation, it is a pleasure to introduce the next speaker, New York State Assemblywoman Amy Paulin. She is the lead sponsor of the Child Access Prevention and Safe Weapons Storage Law. That law, if passed, would require all guns in the home to have a lock or be safe so that they cannot be fired accidentally. And she's a member of the state legislators against illegal guns. I heard her behind the curtain while we were waiting, just being very, very specific about what the federal law does, what the state law does or doesn't do. She's a real expert on the topic. And earlier today, her colleague in the Assembly, Brian Kavanaugh, who represents the Murray Hill section of Manhattan and who's really smart and a good friend, he joined state legislators from across the country to announce the formation of a new nonpartisan national coalition, American State Legislators for Gun Violence Prevention. I must admit, I've been around doing this work for a long time. It's always a challenge. You probably know this, but I learned that the NRA not only does the kind of pro-gun legislation and pro-gun advocacy that is anathema to me, but it turns out they have insurance programs. They probably give out turkeys at Thanksgiving. They pretend that they're like the parent so that they can grab all of us into their fold. So when we're talking about these issues, understand we're up against a very big challenge. and it's not something that we take lightly. And so all of these workshops, your participation, John Jay, these groups, unfortunately, it's all necessary to make our neighborhood safer, our families safer. So without further ado, I want to introduce this wonderful Assemblywoman to talk specifically about what we can work on together. Thank you very much for being here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, there's going to be a slight change in the program. Yes, I am Assemblywoman Amy Paulin, but I'm not going to be the first presenter. I'm going to turn the podium over to Leah Barrett, who is the Executive Director of New Yorkers Against Gun Violence. And the reason we're switching is because I'm going to be covering the laws and loopholes in the laws in New York State. And Leah is going to be covering those same laws and loopholes at the federal level, and we just thought it would be make a little more sense to give you the broader picture and then to narrow it down and talk about New York. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the podium over to Leah.
Thank you very much, and good evening. So as my presentation says, it's what's happening at the federal level, and there are some laws actually. But just very quickly, I think most of you know who are here tonight the scale of the problem of gun violence in our country. These are recent statistics from the CDC, and you can see for yourself that it really truly is a public health crisis. And we know that a gun in a domestic violence situation often does mean the difference between an argument and a funeral. We know the facts that it's 5 times more likely if you have a gun in the home in a situation with domestic violence that there will be a homicide. And the fact that comparing ourselves to other high-income nations, we don't come off looking too good in this area. So I think a lot of these statistics we probably have heard that it's astonishing. More than half of the women murdered with guns were killed by an intimate partner. And over 6,000 between 2001 and 12, and the fact that guns are used in this kind of confrontation more than any other weapon. And I think you know with guns, they are very, very lethal and quite effective in accomplishing their stated intent, which is to kill. So if you look at intimate partner-related homicides committed with a gun over 2003 to 12, and look at the 6 lowest states, the states that do relatively well, you'll see that New York ranks number 5 with 30.5% of homicides committed with a gun in domestic violence or intimate partner situations. And there's no coincidence here. These states, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Illinois, Hawaii, New York, and New Jersey, do tend to have stronger gun laws. And so the message is consistent that smart gun laws actually do work in terms of saving lives. And conversely, if you look at the states with the worst record, then it's topped by Kentucky, which has an astonishing nearly 71% of homicides in an IP situation that are committed with a gun. And again, looking at these Idaho, Montana, Alabama, West Virginia, Arizona, what do they have in common? Very weak gun laws and relatively high gun ownership rates. And those two things tend to go hand in hand when you're talking about gun death and injury. So the federal situation is, you might know that this is 20 years ago, Congress passed VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act. And what that does is prohibits anyone who has a domestic violence restraining order from having a gun. And you can see the effect that this has had because over a certain period, nearly 500,000 people have been barred from buying a gun because of this law, which is showing that it's working. Good laws do keep guns out of the wrong hands. Following VAWA in 1996, 4 years later, Senator Lautenberg from New Jersey proposed the Lautenberg Amendment, and that prohibits people who've been convicted of a domestic violence misdemeanor crime from owning or possessing a gun. And again, this has been proven successful in keeping guns from the wrong hands. Over 100,000 people have been prohibited from buying a gun because of this amendment. And also, it's interesting to know that domestic violence misdemeanors are the 3rd most frequent reason for actually denying applications to buy guns to people who are trying to get them through their licensed dealers. So what is a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence? Well, it's defined to be any kind of offense that's federal, state, or tribal law, and includes the use or attempted use of any kind of physical force or threatened use of any kind of a deadly weapon. But to qualify as an offender under this definition, you have to be a current or former spouse, have some relation to the victim, either share a child in common, formerly cohabiting or currently cohabiting, or have some other similar kind of domestic arrangement with the person. So there are loopholes in our federal law. The laws do not permit at the federal level possession of guns by those convicted of misdemeanor stalking crimes or people who might be abusive in a non-cohabiting dating relationship. So why be concerned about stalkers? Well, because a lot of women are murdered. 76% of women murdered by a current or a former intimate partner did experience stalking in some form before the murder occurred. And 1 in 6 women has actually experienced stalking. And there's a case here in New York, Jackie Wisniewski, who was a nurse in Buffalo, and she was shot and killed in June of 2012 by her ex-boyfriend, who was a doctor, Dr. Tim Jordan. And she had filed a police report when she knew that he was stalking her, but she was never granted a formal protective order. And he turned up at work saying he needed to talk to her privately, pulled out a gun, shot her in the head at point-blank range, and then a few days later, his body was found and he had committed suicide. So why be concerned about dating partner violence? Well, for the same reason. So nearly half of all intimate partner homicides were committed by a dating partner. Former dating partners do tend to commit non-fatal violence against women at a far greater rate than current former spouses, which is interesting, 39% versus 25%. So what's needed to close these loopholes? Well, first of all, you need to limit the accessibility of guns to stalkers and abusers. And you would do this at the federal level basically through 4 steps. You would expand federal prohibitions to include stalkers and abusive dating partners, first of all. And then you would also restrict those who are subject to temporary restraining orders from owning or possessing guns. And you certainly should expand the background check system to make sure these abusers don't get their hands on guns. And then you also, of course, need to improve the domestic violence submission of records to the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, which is called NICS, because it's only dependent on the quality of the data that states are inputting. And some states are better at this than others. Now there is, of course, like there was for background checks for all gun sales, there is broad public support in America for these kinds of common sense measures that will keep guns out of the wrong hands. So recent polls have shown that 81% of all Americans would support banning anyone from owning a gun if that person has violated a domestic violence restraining order, for example. And interestingly, most gun owners and non-gun owners support banning gun ownership for 10 years after any kind of a domestic violence conviction. So we hope that Congress gets a message at some point. Now, there's some proposed federal legislation that we should be aware of. Senator Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota has proposed the Protecting Domestic Violence and Stalking Victims Act. And this would basically prevent stalkers from buying or possessing guns. And it would also prevent any dating partner with an abusive record from, with a DV misdemeanor, for example, or order of protection from buying or owning guns. And it was introduced in 2013, and it has a House companion bill, H.R. 4906. You also have the Lori Jackson Domestic Violence Survivor Protection Act, and that was proposed by Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut. And again, it would do some of the same things, prevent stalkers from buying or owning guns, or abusive dating partners, or those subject to a temporary restraining order. And it's introduced as a particular bill number 2483. Now, do these have a chance of passing? Probably not. And then you also, of course, have the famous Manchin-Toomey and Thompson-King background check bill, which Manchin-Toomey was the Senate bill, and that failed, as you know, the Senate in April of 2013, just a few months after the Sandy Hook massacre. And what that would have done is expand background checks to online sales of guns and also sales at gun shows. And HR 1565 is the Thompson King. Peter King here from New York is one of the sponsors, and Congressman Thompson from California, and it has 188 co-sponsors. And why is this important? Well, there's a very famous case, Chicago spa shooting you may have heard in October of 2012. There was a man named Radcliffe Houghton, and he killed his wife Zena. They were separated, and 2 other women when he showed up at the spa where his wife worked. Now, Radcliffe was prohibited from buying a gun. His name was entered into the National Instant Criminal Background Check System, so he could not legally buy a gun if he were to go to a federally licensed gun dealer. His name would have popped up and they would have said prohibited. So what did he do? He went online, and he went to armslist.com, and he bought a gun there where no questions asked, no background checks. He takes the gun, turns up at his wife's work, kills her, 2 of her coworkers, and injures 4 others, and then commits suicide himself. So there are, of course, other ways to get guns. And so, closing the gun show loophole or the private sales loophole, which is probably a better description, is absolutely essential, not only to keep domestic abusers from getting guns, but anyone who shouldn't have a gun from obtaining one. Now, there is some good news because the states are leading the way when it comes to protecting women in domestic violence situations from abusive partners with guns. So there are 12 states that prohibit people convicted of violent misdemeanors against dating partners from having guns, and 25 states, including New York, prohibit gun possession by at least some people subject to protective orders for dating partners. So again, like so many things, I think Congress will follow along last when enough states have taken the right steps. And to give you some encouragement, even a state like Louisiana last year passed a domestic violence and gun bill. And it was interestingly fronted by the United Way. And it was passed in very, very red Louisiana. So that gives us some hope that these kinds of bills actually do have some traction, if not at the federal level, then certainly at the state level. And let me end just by saying the chart that I showed earlier about strong gun laws mattering in the matter of women being murdered by domestic partners with guns. Just overall, strong gun laws make a big difference. So the states with higher gun ownership and weak gun laws do tend to have the highest rates of gun death, and that shouldn't surprise anybody. The latest rankings put Wyoming on top. And then, of course, you can see the usual suspects, Louisiana, Alaska, Mississippi, and Alabama. And then, conversely, again, New York is number 4. Our gun violence rate, 4.99 per 100,000 people. We should be number 1, and that's what we're striving to be. There's still far too many people dying from guns in New York. The figure for 2012 was 977 homicides. So I will turn over to Amy now, but we wanted to make sure that people know that there are things that they can do leaving tonight, and certainly you can contact your federal representative about the bills that we discussed, but more importantly here at the state level, there's a new session that's going to be starting in January, and Amy's going to be talking about bills that she specifically is going to be introducing and other members of the State Assembly that actually, I believe, do have a chance of passing because domestic violence and guns does tend to be supported by both Republicans and Democrats. So what I would encourage you to do, since we don't have bill numbers yet for these bills, please sign up for our website, and we will be sending out alerts in January, February, once we know what these bills are, and then we can actually start advocating more in earnest. So thank you very much.
Great, I'm back. First, I wanted to get a sense of who you are, because it'll help me elaborate a little better on the subject matter. So there's a large age discrepancy in the audience. I am assuming that you can show me by your hand raising. There's undergraduates here, undergraduates, and graduate students, anybody who works in the domestic violence field, working with battered women, agencies, yeah? Anybody working in the gun control area? Oh, we've got a lot of different kinds of people here. So you can probably learn more from each other than you can learn from any of us up at the podium. But I'm going to give it a shot. So the undergraduate and the graduate students, if you don't work in any of those fields, raise your hand just so I can. Okay, so when you know, if you're students, are you criminal justice students by any chance, or just it's a variety, right? I'm assuming variety. Raise your hand. Variety. Okay, good. You know, I have a master's in criminal justice, and I also have been the executive director of an agency serving battered women prior to having been in the legislature. So I know firsthand how complicated some of the terminology is, and you know, and how complicated, you know, some of these concepts are to put all together. And in fact, you know, the laws are so convoluted, frankly. All laws are convoluted, for those of you who are in the criminal justice area, because we do them one law at a time. And one law at a time often means one word at a time, one sentence at a time, one change at a time. So they don't always fit like a glove. And that is so true of the laws regarding guns in New York State, and frankly the laws regarding domestic violence in New York State, and how they interface in New York State as well. So if you don't understand some of the concepts, feel free to ask. We hope to have the answers, but it could simply be that, you know, the complexity or the lack of conformity, the lack of organization is aiding to your lack of understanding. So with that, I have some prepared remarks, and I don't have a power slide, but you know, we'll go somewhat slowly, and you know, and again, if you have questions, I don't mind taking them as we go along. So we can try that. So you know, I think you've heard domestic violence escalates over time. That's a well-known fact. You know, it often starts with it could be an abusive tone, it could be an abusive word, soon escalating to all kinds of behavior. And I'll tell you one story. When I was first getting involved in the domestic violence area, victims don't always know that they're victims. And I just remember this so telling, because you're going to say, or you're going to think just what I did when I heard. I went to a lecture on, you know, what is domestic violence and what are we doing about it. And a woman afterwards came over to the speaker, the then executive director of the agency I later took over, my sister's place, and asked. She said, "You know, I don't know if I'm being abused." And Charlotte Watson said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, my husband keeps a crowbar in our car, and he threatens me with it, but he's never used it. Am I a victim of domestic violence?" And you know, I wanted to jump up, down, and say, "Yeah, you're being threatened," but she truly didn't know. And the same is true often if there's threats being used with that gun. You know, and guns are often used to scare and intimidate, and that's as big a problem that we have in the domestic violence community as in using that gun. You know, in fact, it's probably, there's more times that the gun is going to be used to intimidate and threaten and scare. But obviously it can escalate, and it does. And, you know, there's a statistic, I think I heard it, you know, that abused women are 6 times more likely than other women to be killed when there's a firearm in the house. So for today's discussion, I wanted to present some of the loopholes and problems that we have in New York State, and to tell you that, you know, we do have a hope and a prayer of getting some of these bills done. I've had 2 successes over my tenure. They're not easy to do, and we do need the help and the support. So if when you leave here and you do want to be more involved. We do need help and support in order to get these bills to become a reality. But the fact that they have to do with domestic violence is attractive to Republicans as well as Democrats, and the fact that there's guns involved seems to still be an okay thing, you know, on the Republican side. So, so some of the loopholes and problems. So first, you know, let me explain, you know, some technicalities. You know, guns and firearms are, you know, for my purposes, I'm going to be talking about pistols and revolvers because they have a different definition in the law than rifles and shotguns and black powder rifles and shotguns, muzzle-loading firearms and antique firearms. They're all separate categories, and it becomes minutia. But the minutia is important because all of these weapons are lethal, and we need to make sure that we're protected in the law to get all of these weapons out of the house. And we have loopholes that take some of the weapons out, but not others. So the first loophole I wanted to talk about has to do with when we can take away guns, rifles, and shotguns. Now that's, again, all the categories, right? So under current law, when a person is convicted of a felony or serious offense, and those have definitions in the law, the court must revoke any existing license to possess a firearm that the person has and order the immediate surrender of any firearms, rifles, and shotguns he owns or possesses. Now, in New York City, we have licenses for long arms, you know, shotguns and rifles. And we also have licenses for pistols and revolvers. That's not true for the rest of the state. The rest of the state only licenses pistols and revolvers. So when we talk about being convicted of a serious felony or offense and being able to revoke someone's license, in New York City it has more meaning than it does outside of New York City. The law also requires the court to revoke an existing license and order the surrender of all firearms. Again, that's that's pistols and revolvers, when an order of protection has been issued and the court finds either a substantial risk that the person may use or threaten to use a firearm against the person protected by the order, or the person willfully failed to obey an order and that willful failure involved the infliction of physical injury, the use or threatened use of a deadly weapon or dangerous instrument, behavior constituting a violent felony offense, or behavior constituting stalking. So New York is one of those states where stalking is included, and it's understood that there is a risk when someone is stalked. But having said that, these conditions are sometimes hard to prove. And if having been on the other side representing and working with victims of domestic violence, because they fill out a form to get an order of protection, if they fail to put on that form that there's a firearm, you know, then these questions are not asked and those guns are not taken away, even temporarily. So there's gaps. The law does not, however, provide for the surrender of guns, rifles, or shotguns upon a conviction of a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence. So there's a gap in the law under federal and state law. He or she would be prohibited from buying a gun. The incident with Hiram Montserrat, that was a pretty famous incident, you know, for those of you who follow state government, he's a former state senator, is a case in point. Montserrat was convicted of assault in the 3rd degree when he slashed his girlfriend with a broken glass, an offense that under current state law constitutes a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence if the appropriate intimate relationship is found. That conviction would prevent him from buying a gun under federal or state law or possessing a gun under federal law, but without a change in state law, he could possess the gun in state law. So here, the guy was a definite threat to this woman and was convicted as such. And under state law, he could still possess a gun. So accordingly, if Montserrat had legally owned a gun when he was convicted, he would not have been required to surrender it. So I've introduced a bill that would close this loophole by requiring that any person convicted of a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence must surrender any firearms, rifles, and shotguns. And let me tell you how serious a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence is. The person has to be nearly dead to get a conviction, a misdemeanor conviction. And I'm not exaggerating. It is an unbelievable, those of you in domestic violence know this, it is very difficult to get that level of conviction. So there are going to be so many women at risk out there, even if she took the guy to court and there was a criminal trial and he was convicted, that level of conviction is very hard. So here you have a circumstance where there's a clear indication of danger, and you cannot force the surrender of those guns out of the house. And you also know, for those of you in domestic violence, and if you don't, when there's been any episode or any experience for holding accountable that perpetrator or that abuser, that is the time when this woman is at highest risk. So if the gun is there, that's when you're going to see it being used. So here, you can't take it away by law, but you're putting this woman in a terrible situation. So we've the second gap in the law has to do with what law enforcement can take away in addition to guns, rifles, and shotguns. Because remember in the beginning, there's a lot of others: antique weapons, black powder. So we've learned from law enforcement, in particularly upstate New York, I would say that's even north of me, I'm in Westchester, that black powder rifles, black powder shotguns, and muzzle-loading firearms are very common in rural areas and often used for hunting, and they're very powerful. So the shot from a muzzle-loading firearm travels faster than from other rifles, and it is more deadly because it does not pass through the body, but rather scatters shot throughout the body, inflicting even more damage. These rifles and shotguns pose a particular problem in rural communities when the police or sheriffs go to seize firearms to enforce a court order. So local law enforcement cannot seize black powder rifles and shotguns or muzzle-loading firearms or antique firearms because they don't fall within the definition of a firearm, rifle, or shotgun. So even if we now have law enforcement acknowledging that they want to get their weapons out of the house, we have the convictions necessary to do that, we have the order of protections in place necessary to do that, because there are black powder rifles and because antique firearms and so forth are not included in the definition, you can't take them out of the house. So first it's hard to get, first we don't have enough laws to allow us to take them out of the house, and then the laws that do allow us to take them out don't even allow us to take out very lethal ones. So that's the second very important loophole. So it makes no sense that law enforcement is authorized to take guns, rifles, or shotguns from someone who's been convicted of a felony or serious offense, but not able to take any black powder rifles, black powder shotguns, muzzle-loading firearms, or antique firearms, even if they're in plain sight, and even if they cause injury or death, or to be used to threaten injury or death as effectively as guns, rifles, and shotguns can. So in addition, even though it's a crime to possess a black powder rifle or shotgun, because it's a crime, a muzzle-loading firearm or an antique firearm upon a conviction or a felony or a serious offense, it's not a crime to possess these weapons where a person has been convicted of a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence. Again, nearly dead woman. My bill will establish that it is a crime to possess a black powder rifle or shotgun, a muzzle-loading firearm, and I say these words a lot because I want you to remember them, or an antique firearm upon a conviction of a misdemeanor crime of domestic violence, and will require the surrender of any of these same firearms or weapons owned or possessed upon the conviction of a felony, serious offense, or misdemeanor crime. So it would close all the loopholes. It would expand when we can take away the guns, and it would expand what kinds of guns we can take away. So with this legislation, when we close the two loopholes, we'll make it clear that if you've been convicted of a felony, serious offense, or misdemeanor crime of domestic violence, you will lose any existing license to possess you have. You'll be required to surrender any guns, rifles, shotguns, and all of those other types, black powder rifles, black powder shotguns, muzzle-loading firearms, or antique firearms you own or possess. If you don't surrender them, law enforcement will be able to seize them, and it will be a crime to possess a gun, rifle, shotgun, black powder rifle, black powder shotgun, muzzle-loading shot firearm, or antique firearms. So it'll be a crime to possess them in addition. So another problem that needs to possess. Now I'm going to talk about two other bills that I've worked on with my colleagues, but I'm not going to be the lead sponsor on. We like to divvy it up a little bit. So another problem that needs to be addressed involves the removal of weapons from the home where law enforcement responds to a domestic violence incident. We've learned, Nassau police, every police department works a little differently. And if those of you who are in New York City, you think of the NYPD, a big police department that represents and does law enforcement in the entire city of New York. When you think of Nassau, it's similar. Nassau County Police, similar, it's a large county, and the Nassau County Police really do, a large job. So it's easier sometimes to coordinate an effort when you have large police departments. Where I live in Westchester, we have little towns and villages. I live in a little village of 16,000 people that has its own police department. The neighboring village, 10,000 people, has its own police department. So you can't always get that kind of coordination, and they don't always, sometimes they do a better job in some areas, but sometimes they don't. And so Nassau started to, when they realized, because how does a domestic violence incident usually, how do you find out about it, right? A neighbor calls, sometimes the victim calls, police arrive, and there's a pro-arresta policy. So they go in and they say, okay, I see, she has a black eye, and they arrest the guy. They're forced to, right? So what the Nassau police have taken the liberty of doing is when they go in there, if they see gun, they take the gun. And, they do this, and it's very effective, and they take it until the whole thing is settled with is a temporary order of protection, later a full order. Later, a conviction of any sort, but the gun is out of the house, and that doesn't occur anywhere else in New York State because the Nassau Police Department has decided that that they're going to do this, and we want to make it clear in the law that every police department should do this and has the legal right to do this. So there's a legislator in Queens, Neely Rosick, who's introduced a bill to do just that, and that's a very important bill. And again, we're going to have the loophole bill, as we're going to call it, which would deal with the possession and surrender to expand when you take the guns out and what the guns are. We're going to have the Rosick bill, which is going to make it clear that police have the authority to take the guns out when there's an incident of domestic abuse. And then the final bill that I want to just mention and then close, is being introduced. You heard the name Brian Kavanaugh. He, he represents part of Manhattan. He is another colleague, and he has modeled a bill this year that is very similar to legislation recently signed into law in California, which would allow a family member, friend, or medical professional to apply for a gun violence restraining order to prohibit someone from possessing a firearm, rifle, or shotgun. And if the person who's been issued a gun violence restraining order possesses or owns a firearm, rifle, or shotgun, the judge will direct law enforcement to seize that firearm, rifle, or shotgun. So it's modeled similarly to an order of protection, but it would be its own order. And I think we're going to wait a little bit and see how it's working in California, but it's certainly a very interesting concept. And, Brian is introducing it here in New York hopefully we'll be able to pass something similar. So so there'll be three bills. We have bills devoted specifically to guns, and we have bills specifically devoted to domestic violence. So what I tried to give you is the overview of the three bills that we're going to have that crosses both of those categories. And, again, we heard how deadly domestic violence is when there's guns in the house. So these are three very important measures, and we're, again, looking for your help, your support, and even if it's writing a letter, even if it's coming on lobby day, it would be very appreciated. So thank you so much. And I'm not sure who I'm supposed to introduce, because I was supposed to introduce Leah, and I already did that. So I'm going to find out.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Rose Pierre-Louis, and I'm the Commissioner of the Mayor's Office to Combat Domestic Violence. And I just want to begin by thanking New Yorkers Against Gun Violence and Leah and Q and Sally for hosting this, as well as Assemblymember Paulin, who I think it is really amazing the leadership that she has provided in the legislature, really shining a light on this issue, and certainly to Gail Brewer, our great borough president. I have the great pleasure of introducing my senior advisor, Ed Hill, and I'll do so in a minute. One of the reasons why I felt it was so important for OCDV to participate in tonight's discussion is because I was so delighted to see that we were really connecting the dots between domestic violence and gun violence. And oftentimes when you think about and you hear about initiatives related to gun violence, most often it's associated with boys and gangs. And we haven't really sufficiently highlighted the impact of guns and its impact on girls and women. And I just want to thank tonight's organizers for doing that and for having this discussion. I think stats are important because it really helps to tell the story, and to really, what I like to do is to connect the dots and really drilling down on New York City. What we had talked about earlier is that a quarter of all domestic violence homicides are committed with a firearm. I thought this particular stat was interesting. Since 2011, almost half, 47% of all domestic violence homicides involving a firearm occur in the borough of Brooklyn, which accounted for 33% of all non-firearm domestic violence homicides and 31% of the city's population. I think also understanding the impact of domestic violence, its disparate impact of DV and gun violence on particular communities, and I don't think we stress this enough, is that African Americans account for 63% of victims of domestic violence homicides involving a firearm, when African Americans account for only 23% of New York City's population. Black women account for 50% of the victims of domestic violence homicides involving a firearm, and black women only account 13% of New York City's population. So this is why this kind of conscious raising and discussion is extremely helpful. I'm pleased now to introduce someone who I rely on in my office for guidance and thoughts and helping us to put data and research to really help illuminate what's happening in terms of the impact of domestic violence in this city. And that's Ed Hill, my senior advisor. Just some brief highlights about his career before coming to OCDV. He was the Director of Policy and Research at Americans for Gun Safety, where he researched and co-authored numerous cutting-edge research reports on the lax oversight of the firearms industry, the lack of enforcement of federal firearm laws, the flow of firearms from legal to illegal markets, and the inadequate firearm purchase background check system. He also served as a research advisor in several suits against the gun industry, including the one brought by the NAACP against the firearms industry and the Open Society Institute, where he co-authored the first national report that reviewed and compared state-level firearm laws. I'm sorry that President Travis is not here, because he'd be pleased to know that Ed is a graduate and an alum of John Jay College, where he earned his bachelor's degree in 1991. Please join me in welcoming Edward Hill.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you for having me here tonight to talk to you about gun violence and domestic violence. I'm going to give you a quick overview of domestic violence generally in New York City, give you some stats so you can get a sense of how pervasive it is, and then go into talking about firearms and how they interact with domestic violence, and how we're learning over time that it might be very beneficial for domestic violence advocates and firearm safety advocates to work together on this issue. So let me just give you a couple of really quick statistics, and that is last year there were 62 domestic violence homicides in the city. To put that into perspective, there are about 335 homicides in New York City, so about 1 out of every 5 homicides are domestic violence related. And when I use the term here, domestic violence related, I mean anybody related by blood or by marriage. There were 284,000 domestic violence incidents that the police responded to. So over 250,000 times last year, the New York City Police Department went to someone's home or answered a call and determined that domestic violence was related in their reason why they were called out. And these stats here, these next 2 stats, are actually rather surprising to me. When I originally calculated them using some data I got from the NYPD, I actually originally thought they were wrong. But after some recalculation and talking to the police department, it turns out they're actually very correct. And that is 40% of all felony assaults in New York City, which is one of the most numerous felony crimes in the city. 40% of those are domestic violence related, and that percentage actually has been going up over the last couple of years. And 1/3 of all rapes in New York City are actually between folks who are related in a domestic way. This will just give you an idea in the city about how geographically domestic violence homicides fall out. You'll see that the Bronx had 16 and Brooklyn had 26. And you'd kind of expect that, actually. Brooklyn has the largest population of any borough in New York City. What's surprising, though, if you looked at that as on a population basis, actually the Bronx would have a slightly higher rate of both domestic violence homicide and domestic violence incidents. So in the far column there, I have listed the domestic violence incidents for last year by borough, and you can see there were a little over 90,000 in Brooklyn and 80,000 in the Bronx. And so actually in the Bronx, there were many more people affected by domestic violence if you do it based on just on population. The other statistic that we've been looking at over the last couple of years and trying to get an understanding of is how domestic violence interacts with other type of social issues that are going on in the community. And one of the ways we look at that is we plot out domestic violence homicides across the city and then look at these other social and economic factors that go on. And if you do that, you'll see that 42% of domestic violence homicides happen in communities with high poverty, high unemployment, low education attainment. And just to put that in perspective, only 24% of the city's population actually live in communities that fall under that designation. So actually, the rate of domestic violence homicides in those communities are significantly higher than in communities that have higher, I should say, lower rates of poverty and higher rates of education attainment. These stats here just give you a sense now of how firearms play a role in domestic violence incidents. So roughly 1/4 of all domestic violence homicides last year, and if you took this statistic and kind of stretched it out over time, over a 10-year period, the statistic would be roughly the same. Generally, 1/4 of all domestic violence incidents in New York City occur with a firearm. The number 1 weapon in New York City, by the way, is actually a knife. And if you look at New York State, it's almost the same. It's 26% over the same time period. that percentage also has not changed much over the last decade. This slide here gives you a little bit closer look at a subset of domestic violence. When most people in the field of domestic violence use the term domestic violence, they are really talking about intimate partners, those folks who are married or were married or have a child in common. So these stats here will give you a sense of how often a firearm is used in homicides that involve that relationship. And you see in New York State, actually, fully 1/3 of the homicides involving intimate partners involved a gun. In New York City, the rate is actually 20%. So 1 out of every 5 homicides involving an intimate partner was perpetrated by someone using a firearm. And just to kind of give you some context here about how this looks nationally, or some of the other ways that domestic violence intersects with gun violence, and that is, a study came out last year that looked at homicides that involved mass shootings. So just to be clear, the definition of mass shooting is a homicide where at least 4 individuals were killed. And in 57% of those mass shootings, the person's intimate partner was also killed. So you can see firearms play a big role. The intersection of DV and firearms play a pretty big role in mass shootings across the United States. So just to kind of get a sense of how different or how similar domestic violence homicides are that are committed with a firearm as opposed to those that are not, I put together this chart just to look at some of the key indicators across several demographics. So the first one is female. The reason I chose female is females account for roughly 65 to 70% of all domestic violence homicide victims in New York City on any given year. So, and you can see when a firearm is involved, they account for about 65%. So not really that different from you would see like looking at the entire homicide set together. What does stand out are 2 key points. The victim being Black. They're much more likely to be a victim of a domestic violence homicide involving a firearm. You can see 63% of all of the homicides where a firearm was used, the victim was Black. And in fact, if you combine that with female, so Black females account for almost 70% of the victims when a firearm is used. I mean, that's a pretty astounding number considering Black females account for about 15% of New York City's population. You can see just how disproportionate that actually is. The other thing I'll point out is that the possibility that the perpetrator is going to commit suicide is much higher, about 11 times higher when a firearm is used. And the reason that's important is when advocates are working with individuals who are domestic violence victims, they might want to probe whether the abuser is threatening to commit suicide, because if they are, it might be an indicator that the victim is at much higher risk to being a homicide victim. This also shows you, if you remember before I said that Brooklyn, had more domestic violence homicides, but you should take into account that the Bronx has a smaller population. When you look at just firearms, that actually doesn't hold true. Brooklyn accounted for almost half of all domestic violence homicides where a gun was used. And if you look at it in homicides where a gun was not used, they account for about 1/3, but that's what you would expect considering they account for about 1/3 of the population. So that is a much higher number than you would actually expect. And that actually brings me to the last slide here. So as I mentioned when I started, it's when you look at these statistics and you think about how guns interact with domestic violence, you start to understand that firearm advocates and DV advocates should work together. And I should say, as the commissioner noted, I actually come from a background where I was a firearm prevention advocate, firearm safety advocate. And when I left that field, I was thinking, oh, I'm going into a new field. I'm going into domestic violence, not thinking that, it's been 9 years now, and here I am talking about how guns interact with DV. So they're very closely related. If you look in New York City, beyond the stats I already gave you, and why folks who are trying to combat the gun violence in the city should be working with the DV advocates, it's this one stat that really kind of sticks out. Since 2011, so between 2011 and the end of 2013, 43% of domestic violence homicides actually occur where there's already a gun violence reduction program going on. Excuse me. So, but that gun violence reduction strategy is usually looking at street level gun violence, right? Not what happens in the home. Because most, about 80% of domestic violence homicides actually occur behind closed doors. But you can see they're co-occurring in the same neighborhood. And I believe, and I don't have any statistics really to back, any kind of research project to point to, I would bet that even some of that street level violence, the undercurrent of that is probably, relates back to DV. Somebody looked at someone's girlfriend the wrong way, and the next thing you know, it sparked violence out in the community. And that is pretty much the end of my presentation. I hope I didn't throw too many stats at you. I had promised that I would kind of pick up the pace of my presentation so we could make up some time. But I'll be here. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask me. Have a nice evening.
And before we begin, I just want to thank John Jay for co-sponsoring this event and providing the space, and to all of our co-sponsors and panelists for taking the time out and joining us tonight, and of course to all of you for I know it's kind of cold outside, so spending some time with us tonight as well. And so the main part of this roundtable conversation is to really kind of look at the two fields that we're discussing tonight: the domestic violence or intimate partner violence field, and also the gun violence or anti-gun violence work that's being done in New York City, and really kind of look at how we can, kind of lift the veils and the different silos that we happen to work in, and look at how the two fields are so much related, and there's an intersection between domestic violence and gun and gang violence here in New York City, and figure out ways that we can, work more effectively together. And tonight is just a beginning of a conversation and of work that needs to happen here in New York City. So we're going to kind of really look at how can we see what work is being done, and then look at which way forward in terms of uniting forces and resources to really make an impact on violence in our communities. And first off, we have Erica Ford, who is the founder of Life Camp, and Eric and I go back about 20 years, actually. We were student activists together and community activists, and then we kind of crossed paths once again, and looking at the work that she's doing in South Jamaica, Queens, and throughout New York City as well. So it's a pleasure to have Erica on the stage, and we've been on many stages throughout the many years that we've known each other. So thank you, Erica. And we also have Katie Gentili, who is John Jay's own, so give her a round of applause. And she is Associate Professor of Counseling and Director of the Gender Studies Program here at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. She has published articles, books on sexual abuse, domestic violence, eating disorders, fetal personhood amendments. She is co-editor of the journal Studies in Gender and Sexuality. So thank you, Katie. And we have Dr. Sally McNichol, who is the co-executive director along with me at Connect. Someone and Sally is like a big part of why I even do this work. So it's it's really good to really, continue to share leadership of connect with her. And, we've been really doing this work together for about close to 20 years. And Sally's been doing domestic violence and intimate partner violence work for about 30 years now. So she's an expert, and it's great to have her here. And we also have Mr. Marlon Peterson, who I've known for a number of years now. He is a writer and activist who has worked with various organizations around issues of community violence, criminal and immigration justice, and race and gender equity. He is currently the Director of Community Relations at the Fortune Society and the David Rothenberg Center for Public Policy. He serves on the New York City Task Force to combat gun violence and is also a board member of New Yorkers Against Gun Violence and Families for Freedom. So welcome. And then we have Mr. Juan Ramos, who is another one I've known for many, many years. We started this work running battles intervention programs about 19 years ago. And Juan is he's an activist. He's an anti-sexism activist. He's an educator working with men and boys toward ending violence and discrimination against women and girls. He's currently the founder and president of Community-Driven Solutions, an organization dedicated to working with offenders of domestic violence. And he's also, he's wearing two hats today. He really works on the intersection of domestic violence and working with abusive men, and also his work with the Center for Court Innovation, Save Our Streets program in Bed-Stuy, where he is currently the program manager for Save Our Streets in Bed-Stuy. And Bed-Stuy is, close and near and dear to Juan, because that's where he grew up and lived for many years, and now he's back doing his work there, representing our good friends from the Center for Court Innovation. So welcome, Juan. So first of all, if we can, just quickly, go around the half circle and really, explain, some of the work that you're currently doing, what the work looks like. And then, if you can really address this question, because right now in New York City, it's a really tough, intense time, right? And one of the things that's been happening around a lack of accountability and justice for victims of violence, right? And that's either from intimate partner violence. Many times survivors of domestic violence look to legal systems for accountability and safety. And many times, and when women are seeking, justice from systems or courts or police, there's definitely a lack of accountability that takes place when we're looking, for some people, it's very difficult to even talk about your experiences around violence, and then seeking help is a whole nother level, because there's a good chance that you're not believed. And that's true for intimate partner violence, and also for other forms of violence and gun violence, no matter who's doing the violence. And when we're not seeking, we're not receiving the accountability through legal systems, it becomes very difficult to report violence, particularly for survivors of any form of violence, to getting the help that they need. So if you all can just briefly talk about the work that you're doing with your current organization or associated organizations that are related to what we're talking about tonight. And then maybe, answer that question. What do we do when there's a lack of accountability from the services and, places that we kind of call on and look for accountability?
When there's a question of a lack of accountability, you have to find accountability. Violence is a disease, and it is a disease that is caught by, like people catch the flu, and people catch this disease of violence in many different ways, and a lot of times it starts in the household, from what we are here talking about, domestic violence. And when you don't know or get help for this, when you talk about from that young age of accountability, it grows and it festers. And then it becomes an epidemic. And I think that is what we're seeing right now. It takes its face in many different ways, from when you see an officer respond to a situation in a form of violence, in a form of ego-driven and fear-based. All of that comes from something. It comes from a mindset. When you see, we deal with violence intervention and prevention in South Jamaica, and we had a call last week of a young man who allegedly stabbed to death his girlfriend. And when you unfolded the situation, domestic violence was all inside of that. And when you go to get, from where I sit, I'm able to get accountability. So
What does that look like?
accountability is getting assistance for the individual, whether it's, the assistance of the removal. Most of the times, women, when you talk about the lack of accountability, the face of that is the woman does not get help, or the victim does not get help. So in our situation, we make sure that somebody is helping that victim, whether it's, making them feel safe, whether it's removing someone from their environment so that that situation doesn't arise, or being the accountability for the person, by providing that support and that system of support to that individual. But when we want to address the question of domestic violence, and not so much the question of, to me, the question of accountability, but where does it come from? And what is the mindset that follows that? Because the lack of accountability and the necessity to assist that individual is because of lack of looking at it as a situation that needs assistance. So if you're walking past a homeless person every day in the street, and you just walk past that person, it becomes your norm. That is not a problem. That's that person laying on the street. When you see the young people and they're on the phone and they're screaming and yelling, and it's 99% of the time at a woman, and you're walking by, you don't look at that as a problem. When people fight in the household, a lot of times we create, and I'm the one, we create environments that give rise to certain behaviors. And we don't see what we do as something that gives rise to this behavior. For an example, we live in an angry and hostile state. So I know that the majority of the time when I was woken up in the morning, I was woken up like this. Erica, get up, it's time to go to bed. I'm in to work, to school. What do you mean, get up, what? Yeah. It's always that kind of environment. And it becomes a norm, that kind of, and rush, and we're just moving, and we're not thinking, we're not connected, we don't have a place of compassion for other people. What is this experience? So I became that person. So when I spoke, I didn't speak from a thinking space. Although I was the peace person, I came from a place of just, I wanted what I wanted, when I wanted, and how I wanted.
I'll tell you all about that.
So in reality, I was creating a very violent and hostile environment in my stretch for peace. And it was a norm for me. So how my words were used was not a thought process. And most of us walk through, as we fight domestic violence, as we fight for peace, we are doing it from an angry place. So we're not looking at what we're creating and who we're creating, because we're around people every day. So our job at Life Camp is to change the way people, first and foremost, deal with their own pain and their own trauma, how they internalize, and the stories and the beliefs and the lifestyle that we were conditioned to live in. Because a lot of it is wrong. A lot of it is wrong. And then how do we go out and address the question of violence, whether it's domestic violence, gun violence, violence as it relates to, you know, brawls and fights and so on and so forth. And we have we are part of the team, just like some of the people on stage, where we use the Cure Violence model as a basis, and we have a series of wraparound services that try to bring a holistic approach to the question of violence because we look at it as a disease.
Katie.
Thanks. I really am coming at it from an educator, academic educator, higher ed educator, higher in quotes, of course. I spent years here. I started at John Jay in 2000, and I opened and grew the Women's Center here for years. I was the director of the Women's Center, and that's kind of how I got to know people like Connect and a lot of the activist organizations. And it was really, I mean, I think what Erica said is really important, and part of that also is, we were talking a little bit backstage, dealing with your disappointment at the lack of accountability that you will see over and over and over again. And I got to admit, I didn't deal with it very well. That's why I left the Women's Center, partially, because it was really, it can be burning out if you don't have, you know, set goals high, but have some realistic fallback goals that you can feel good about. And after 10 years of working really really intensely with domestic violence, primarily victims, mostly women, but not always women, at the hands of men. And it was very frustrating, feeling like, you know, I worked to get a CUNY policy so that every school, all the colleges, there's 19 campuses of CUNY, so we'd all kind of deal with it similarly, because it seemed like not every campus had a women's center, different campuses dealt with it differently. Like our public safety tended to be better than the nightmare stories I was hearing. So basically I worked to try to get like a little more consistency and accountability on those levels, which was not easy. And now I guess I'm director of gender studies because I really wanted to take on masculinity more, in a more active way. Violence against women doesn't end until masculinity is unpacked. Yeah, and you guys are doing that work, and my work in that field is always going to be limited by the fact that I am a white woman, but that doesn't mean I don't have something to say about masculinity. And so when I teach my classes, and I feel extra effective when I have, you know, obviously I get to teach at John Jay. I feel like I'm super, super lucky because I got to tell you, teaching masculinity at a criminal justice college, I just think it's one of the it's so important. So if I can teach a firefighter or, you know, when I have, I made sure Gender Studies 101 and another Gender Studies class were in the Gen Ed. What that means is everyone gets to take it and have it count whether or not they major or minor in gender studies. But the idea is, if I can have, right now we get about 500 students exposed to gender studies every semester. And I feel like, you know, maybe they're not going to take up the call, but maybe if they're a police officer, they're going to think twice. And that includes, you know, racial profiling, cultural profiling, as well as what I would call gender profiling, you know, because these things are always intersections and they're always going together. And profiling around gender nonconformity, the whole thing goes together. And ideally feeling less vulnerable and ashamed, because I'm a psychologist, so I come from the thing that a lot of violence is enacted because someone feels vulnerable and ashamed and can't handle it. And we don't allow boys and men to feel vulnerable. And if we don't do that, we're going to have a lot of violence, especially in intimate partner relationships, because that is the place where we all feel most vulnerable, and out of control. So I guess I'll stop there.
Thank, you know, and thank you for that, Katie, because we're going to talk more about masculinity and how that is the real common denominator between a lot of domestic violence and intimate partner violence and gun and gang violence as well. And I just want to kind of just emphasize too that a lot of the conversation is about violence against women and girls, but it's also about violence in LGBTQ relationships, and so it's not a one size fits all when we look at how domestic violence works. So I just want to really point out that as well.
Which I appreciated the emphasis on dating, all those loopholes around dating, because we know that impacts so many more people.
Excellent. Great.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, thank you. It's really exciting to hear the way the framework around domestic violence and intimate partner violence has really moved in the last 20 years to a much more holistic, intersectional framework. It's just, everything that both of you said is fitting into this holistic view. And I guess I wanted to just talk about, I was looking at those slides and thinking about, the many years doing this work, and I just wanted to lift up the way, the experience that I've learned from women that I've worked with, the experience of entrapment, because there's, you have a situation in so many communities where you just never feel safe. You don't feel safe at home. You don't feel safe on the streets. You don't feel safe from the people who are protecting you. And I just was the sense of being entrapped by all these different kinds of violence. And it's really hard to talk about, but I think it's an experience that we sometimes forget when we're working with people, that all these multiple areas of violence are coming at them. And if you don't, the universal, this is part of the 16 days of activism, and in 2 days is the end of those 16 days, and that's it's Human Rights Day. And part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says that people have the right to feel safe. And we also know that when you don't feel safe, you can't function. So that trauma, the ongoing trauma that's intergenerational and that just spreads out into a community is, we just can't, we need to go forward in different ways. And I think one of the things that we try to do at Connect and what we work on is creating these spaces where people can really feel safe, and where when you feel safe, you can examine your own experience. Because one of the hallmarks of being oppressed is you can't even examine your own experience in a safe way. And there you can't really think when you're traumatized. So to create these different kinds of environments is really critical, so that you can, in the same breath, say, this police brutality is affecting me, this brutality that's happening from my partner is affecting me, this fear that I have on the streets is affecting me, and the fear of sexual assault when I walk out the door. So I just am appreciating this way of looking at all this and the effect on victims. And we'll talk more later.
Thanks for having me here today. I always say thank you for allowing me into your space to be able to have this conversation with you. The question of accountability, I think the way to sort of, for me to set it off is that, I'm a black heterosexual male from Brooklyn who understands that just because I've been stopped and frisked by police, just because I've been incarcerated, that I'm not the center of the universe. And I think this conversation, unfortunately, when we think about guns particularly, is very spoken, we have this conversation in a very heteronormative, heteropatriarchal sort of way, right? And I think what accountability looks like is like men like me being the folks that are upstanding, that are speaking up against this, and sort of ensuring that women are visibilized in this conversation. I think many times men particularly, we think that just because statistics say we are in these situations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that the conversation needs to be focused around us, which is wrong, right? Because when we look at the community, when we look at the statistics, women, when we look at domestic violence particularly, the form of the method of homicide is usually by a gun. And that's not spoken about enough. And because it's not spoken about enough, because you don't have enough research done on it, folks don't think it's an issue. So when we have something like, something like My Brother's Keeper that says that, we need to focus on black boys and all that sort of stuff because they're the ones that's in trouble. Yeah, we have issues, but we don't live in these communities by ourselves. I think accountability is being able to speak up against these things when we see them. I think accountability also looks like being able to make a connection between state violence and how that affects how women, the mistrust that women have of the state, of police. So there was recently, thankfully it was taken out, but there was a policy called Secure Communities, right? And that's something bringing in the immigration conversation into it. But Secure Communities gave law enforcement basically ICE powers so that they can detain and potentially deport somebody if they just arrest them on the street. So think about a situation where if a woman is in a domestic violence incident with her partner, she may be less likely to call law enforcement because she doesn't want that person to be deported, right? And that's a policy that sort of creates more of a distrust of the community police relations. So I think state violence, accountability also looks like being able to speak up against state violence that also affects how relationships are within households. I think accountability also looks like, as you alluded to, Q, is understanding, once again, it's not the center, but that this includes women, includes folks who are gay, lesbian, transgender, that violence, domestic violence, and guns are all connected. So, I'm just be concise and brief about it, but that's what I think accountability looks like when there are those who are not directly impacted by it, being the ones to also speak up against it.
Great, that's great. And I just want to add, because I think that's important, because we always kind of look at, black men and Latino men and boys as endangered species. And that's a direct result of racism that we experience every single day. And we tend to forget that the women in our lives experience the same forms of racism as we do, and then we come home and then we're abusive towards them in our intimate relationships. So there's like a double layer that goes unnoticed, and like you said, it becomes an invisible story or narrative. That's a central key point to looking at violence in our communities. So Juan, tell us. And Juan, I really appreciate Juan because he's, he comes out of the domestic violence movement and is now doing the work around, anti-violence work and gun violence work and how those things are really intermeshed. And we've been really pushing that for, quite some time. And just recently, Police Commissioner Bratton, talked about gun violence, it being 65% of it is related to domestic violence. And we've always been pushing that children who witness violence in the home are more susceptible or more likely to be involved with gun and gang violence as well in the communities. So Juan, if you could kind of touch on that piece.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank Sally and Q for always thinking of me during these conversations, because I've done a lot of work with you guys and I enjoy it because it's good work and it's grassroots work that you seldom see in organizations. When we talk about accountability, for me, it comes in multiple layers. Accountability means, if we're talking about domestic violence, thinking about who we're serving in domestic violence cases, for example, right? So a lot of the work that I do, for example, in my organization, Community Joint Solutions, is really geared toward working with men who are batterers, men who have already been arrested for domestic violence offenses, men who were caught for domestic violence offenses. Notice I said caught. There's a number of us that commit offenses against our partners who just never get caught, right? So we're talking about a small percentage of the men in our communities, the ones that actually get caught. And when we look at that layer, for example, when we talk about accountability, I think the accountability begins and ends where it starts, and that's around how we as a community address the issue, how we as a society look at the issue, but also how we respond to it in order to protect the majority of the time women who are being impacted by it. So the reality is that if I'm a domestic violence offender, for example, when I go into the criminal justice system, I'm set in a different track than any other man in my community, simply because that's my wife, that's my girlfriend, or I've been intimate with this person in some way or the other. And that has to change when we talk about accountability. right? If I commit an offense against someone where I hurt them physically, then I should be treated like every other offender, not be set aside and given a special set of privileges simply because I'm intimate with this person or we have a relationship, right? Because already that puts the value of women beneath the value of all women, right? So we need to look at accountability from that piece. But I also think that accountability has to be, you know, what we do as a community. As a community, we need to begin to look at domestic violence as our problem. Because normally we look at this as, that's that family's problem, or that happened next door to me. But the reality is that it impacts us all. Because one of the reasons I do this work is because my mother experienced domestic violence. I'm that child that grew up in that domestic violence home. And I'm also that child that left that abuse, tried to get away from that abuse, and ended up on the streets doing things I wasn't supposed to do. That's what drove me at an early age to join a gang. That's what drove me at an early age to carry guns, which is why I'm so passionate about this issue now. And I'm also talking to you because it's something that I like to share with audiences anywhere I'm at, because it's also what took me to a point where I lost my younger brother. See, my younger brother, trying to get away from the violence that we witnessed at home toward my mother, left and went on the street just like I did. He began hanging with people that he shouldn't be hanging with. And eventually, I lost my brother to gun violence. But I didn't lose my brother to gun violence because he was killed. I lost my brother to gun violence because he took a life and in turn gave his life to the system. So this is the impact that domestic violence can have and how it can impact our communities and how these two issues kind of mesh together, right? Which takes me to my work today, where I work at the Center for Court Innovation at Save Our Streets, Bed-Stuy, the community where I was born and raised, because in the same way that I witnessed that and was impacted by that, and so was my family, I know too many neighbors and too many family members who've experienced the same thing and never get to tell their story, speak about their story, because of the shame that there is around domestic violence. And also because of, you know, looking at the whole fact that when we talk about communities, there's this factor where if you say something, then you're a snitch. But the reality is when we don't talk about these issues as a community and hold each other accountable as a community, then there's nothing that can be done about it, right? Because we all have to take responsibility over it. That's accountability. Accountability would mean that if I'm a domestic violence offender and I go to church on Sunday, my pastor or somebody in my church community is saying to me, yo, we don't tolerate that. Accountability in my community means that when I'm shopping at the supermarket and men in my community know that I've been abusive to my partner, they come to me and say, you know what, we heard what happened at your home. We don't tolerate it. Accountability in a community means that wherever I go, even with my employer, if they hear that I've committed domestic violence, they'll send me the message, we heard what happened, we don't tolerate it. Giving me the opportunity to do what? Shift my thinking, change my mindset.
Okay, great.
And finally, accountability is being accountable to all those that are impacted by it, because we've all spoken about domestic violence and we speak about the man as a perpetrator, sometimes not. We're talking about the woman as a survivor, sometimes not. But the reality is that those two, you know, offset each other because we forget about who's in the middle, the silent victim. Those of us that are children growing up in those homes, those of us that are those children running into the community and getting into other forms of violence because that form of violence is all too normal for us because we witnessed it at home on some level or the other. And see, for me, looking at domestic violence, looking at gun violence, and violence overall, I look at it more as a collective socialization that we share, and particularly as men. And that socialization, in the same way that we learn it, we can unlearn it. But guess what? Somebody has to be teaching you to unlearn it. Somebody has to be wanting you to unlearn it. Somebody has to be challenging you to unlearn it. And that doesn't happen without activism, right? But it's a different activism. It's activism where we all take responsibility for it and don't pass the buck.
Great. Thank you, Juan, for that. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time, but I wanted to give an opportunity for the panelists to ask each other questions. And if I can start off with one and maybe really point to Erica and Marlon firstly, to really kind of like, because I know Erica from many years ago when you started Life Camp, and we kind of talked about prevention, right? What prevention looked like, because a lot of the work that you were doing was responding to gun violence in the communities. And so what part of, how does prevention take shape in your work, and how important is that, rather than looking at just responding to when something happens? What are some of the things that you're doing around prevention?
The majority of my work is prevention. It's not responding.
No.
And I think that prevention is, like, part of me sitting up here is like, this decompartmentalness of violence to me is just like, I'm not with it. You know, I think violence is violence, whether it's, you know, all of violence. I don't, you know, and I think that when we get into the compartmental of it, then we're not dealing with preventing it on a real holistic kind of way in terms of the systemic violence that exists in society and where it came from. You know, so an education process is the most important form of prevention. That when we educate people about how to deal with what is happening to them, what meaning, what life are you giving to situations, and that cause you, because even, you know, I mean, it's a very long discussion, but the education is the number one thing, because we, as you know, the brother spoke about, it's a personal responsibility to each question, because although we're in each situation, we can, you know, be taught how to deal with that situation and where does it come from. And you can start from any level. You start, like, we work with both the child and the parent because it goes both ways, and the community, because if you're living in a housing development, everybody is exposed to what is going on every day, you know, and in the culture, the society is violent. Like, everything we do is violent. This is a violent society. The way we learn, the way we eat, the way we, you know, everything is violent. So it's about changing how we live. And that's why, you know, one of the slogans that we have is peace is a lifestyle, because what does that mean? How do we represent the question of peace? If we're talking about, like, to me, I used to spend a lot of time talking about, you know, like, stop the violence or stop this or stop that. But it's more so important to me to promote what it is that I want to achieve. So, and also in the question of prevention, is building the campaigns of education towards what we want to achieve, and changing the culture and changing the interaction of people on that basis, so that we can, you know, all take personal responsibility and change our lives.
What I was really alluding to was, and that's great, but to, like, looking at, when you started looking at domestic violence as part of your prevention around the work that your organization was doing. I know that happened maybe several years ago now, but how was the looking at domestic violence as a root cause important to the prevention work you were doing?
Well, looking at violence in the home is important because that's where you spend, that's where your culture, your lifestyle, your everything comes from, that interrelationship inside of that house. So dealing with what goes on in your house and how you relate to your children, how your children relate to you, and how you relate to your partners is it, you know, because once we change families and how we interrelate and how we raise our children and how we see the world and so on and so forth, we change how you go out into the world. So it's you know, we have to uplift the family and really strengthen the relationships of families in that aspect of dealing with.
You know, I remember.
But I have to excuse myself because on the other table I have, you know, dealing with dementia, which is the health department disease. So I have to go home and take care of my mother, yes.
We have no problems issue with that.
All right, so good night. Thank you
Thank
all
you,
for
Erica.
having. And we look forward to continuing.
Definitely. Thank you, sis.
I know when I first met UQ, I was actually at the time working with SOS Crown Heights, which is another cure violence model, and you came in to do a connecting, and Marlon at the time came in to do a presentation about around domestic violence, and I think at the time we saw it as being a necessity, particularly when we had the conversation that I think Katie alluded to, was masculinity and how that affects, regular gun violence on a street corner, right? In terms of how, in many cases, folks are trying to perform a certain sort of masculinity to be accepted, and how that sort of illustrates itself as, partner and partner abuse. And I think that's important to be able to make those connections as well. If folks are doing, gun violence prevention work, to be able to make those connections, because, gun violence is just an illustration, is a manifestation of a lot of other stuff that already done happen, right? A lot of stuff already happened before somebody got the gumption to be able to pick up a gun and shoot somebody, or take a knife and stab somebody, whatever it is. A lot of other stuff happened, and a lot of it is at the core is masculinity, or folks warped understandings of warped definitions of masculinity, which is sort of informed by a lot of other larger societal issues in terms of racism and all that sort of jazz. But it's important to make those connections. I think in terms of prevention, in terms of avoiding gun violence or preventing folks from getting to that place, understanding of what domestic violence looks like, and there's many forms, right? So we may think it's only just somebody putting a hand in physical, but how we have our conversations, right? And how that leads us to the next thing. So I'm Trinidadian, I have like a washed down Trinidadian accent, but I remember hearing people telling me, Marlon, you have to learn to discipline your money. And that is not going to be taken in many ways, but that's just like common language that we speak to each other, and that's the sort of violent way of passing on the legacy of domestic violence and everything else that could come along with it. So I'm just kind of going back to the conversation about accountability, but also on how things, and I always say, leads to what happens on the street corner or in somebody's apartment, where the language we use is so very violent that it's entrenched and embedded in our minds. So at the point when our emotions get the best of us, we react, and we react in a way that language has already been trained in us since we were little kids.
Great. And then, thank you for that moment. And then for Katie and Sally, if you can speak to some of the conditions that, survivors of violence have to experience, and also, because part of it is about the, transforming attitudes and belief systems, but then it's also, what about the environment that upholds that behavior and says that it's okay? That's really, even if the men that I've worked with, even if they've got to a point of change, it's so easy to kind of revert back because the structures and systems around us kind of, uphold that negative thinking and behavior. If you could briefly speak to that, like, how is that for you in terms of your work, even on campus, or just from a psychological perspective?
Well, I'll give a little anecdote. I was having dinner with a colleague who shall remain nameless, who's not at John Jay, let me just say that. But he's in charge of a program at a university somewhere in New York City. And he was mentioning that one of his colleagues, for years, he's the chair of his department, for years he was getting complaints from students, female students, about one of his colleagues coercing them into sex. And he never reported it because he didn't think it was rape, because coercion isn't rape. Wow. So I guess I say this because it's 2014. I'm a survivor of sexual assault. So I hear it as an educator, as a colleague, and as a horrified victim survivor. To hear someone say, it's not that big of a deal. It's nothing I should be reporting. It's no reason for anyone to lose their job or to even be pulled aside and told to stop. So I guess in saying that, I mean, it really, your term entrapment, I wrote it down because, once upon a time, I remember I read a history of domestic violence, and the language domestic violence, as Ted Bunch and other people have said, it really takes the subject completely out of the word. And that itself tells women and victims, survivors, something really important. The house hit them. It's a domestic violence pursuit. Yeah. I mean, come on, nothing could be more oblique. There was a short period of time where people called it patriarchal terrorism, which gets to the entrapment, because in a patriarchal culture, and now, thanks to intersectionality, we can have racism and homophobia and classism. The entrapment is on so many different levels. And so when you go outside and you know that there's actually a dispute over whether some NFL player who knocked out his girlfriend, and you hear one person say, well, you know, we don't know what she did. That's all you need to realize that you shouldn't report, you shouldn't talk about it. Of course the majority of domestic violence doesn't get reported. Why would it? Why would anyone go through that? In 10 years working with domestic violence survivors, and I'm talking multiples every week, if not every day, I can count on one hand how many people actually went through the criminal justice system, and I can count on this hand, one, who actually got a conviction.
Great, thank you for that, Katie. That's very, very important. Just for the sake of time,
sorry.
if I could just move it forward, and maybe Sally or Juan or Marlon, if you could ask a question of one of the panelists, including myself, if you have a question that you want to answer. Sally.
It's off the cuff. Well, I'm going to freestyle a question, and I think I'll put it to Katie. And you mentioned intersectionality in the conversation about it, and, you know, I don't think people know Kim Crenshaw, intersectionality. That's a good friend of mine's mentor. I guess my question to you is, like, in working on a college campus, so when we have this conversation around, in many cases, the imagery of violence and gun violence and domestic violence, unfortunately, is like an urban community on the block, and that's the imagery that comes up, unfortunately. But on a college campus, I mean, what is that conversation like? Are folks able to sort of make the connection into their own lives, like how these same things that happen maybe in their own neighborhoods happen on the campus and so on?
I could have my students say something, but I mean, to a certain extent, yeah. I mean, I think, you know, John Jay, I will say John Jay is unique because the majority of students here want to be here. And when I say this, when you're in Queens, you go to Queens College. This is not in any way putting down any of the borough colleges. I'm saying if you want to come to John Jay, you want to come to John Jay. It may mean you're coming from Staten Island, from Bed-Stuy, from Queens, Jamaica, anywhere. It means a long commute. So students who come here often have histories of violence in their neighborhoods, violence in their homes, and they're coming here to stop it in a lot of ways. Now, not all of them are thinking the way you are at all, and the intersectionality is tough to teach. It's tough to live. I don't know if that's the answer. There's not as much dialogue as I'd like, and we're working on it.
Yeah, and sometimes it's just like the jargon we use, right? So it's really like breaking that down. Malcolm X said, speaking a language you could understand, especially if you have mastery, because, you know, we use the terms masculinity, we use all these different terms, but when we're in schools and we're in communities, we don't use that terminology because it goes over people's heads. So it's really about breaking it down to their own experiences. But Sally, do you have a question for Juan, or Juan, do you have a question for Sally to kind of close us out?
I mean, maybe I'll just ask a simple question. What do you think is the most difficult transformation that needs to be made in the men that you work with in their lives? What's the core? Was there a?
I think.
And how have you seen that happen?
Right.
And how have you seen that happen?
Very briefly answer that one.
I think in particular for the men that I work with, it is twofold. One, address the violence that they've perpetrated and committed, but yet somehow work on the underlying issues that these same men, while holding them accountable, we also have to understand may have come from homes where they're just reliving and redoing everything that they've learned. And I think that's the hardest piece, because I always say, you know, we've heard being mentioned, you know, is it a disease, whatever. I say, you know, you can treat the illness, but don't excuse the behavior. And you have to do both simultaneously in order to work with men in a way where they get the message.
One more question, just
Very,
general.
very quickly.
I mean, I'm just interested in the role of nonviolence in all this, in teaching nonviolence and teaching peace, because we don't really actually talk about nonviolence and those practices. And I'm talking about internal nonviolence out to larger practices and I just wonder where that is in the conversation.
That's great. And I think that's a good point to close on, is that because it's really about prevention work and then it's effective intervention, but then what is it that we really want to see? What is our vision for communities post-violence, or what is the vision for the communities when we can prevent violence? So I just want to really thank all of you all. And I just one other thing that came up a lot is that, we're talking about trauma, right? We're talking about historical trauma, we're talking about community trauma, we're talking about relationship trauma. And so it's important that we recognize that folks are coming from this place, that there's trauma all over our communities, and then it's also secondary trauma, the trauma that we experience when we're helping people. So it's important that, we think about self-care, doing this work. If you're working with people in counseling or, being part of their lives in any way, you should be in some form of counseling as well, or in some process. So I think that's very, very important that we kind of think about that, because it's traumatic, living every single, and it's not a one single story, right? It's many different stories with many different levels and complexities involved to that, and we soak all of that in. So I think it's important that we take care of ourselves. I want to thank all the sponsoring organizations. I want to thank in particular our staff, Kathleen Cogswell for putting a lot of work into this, Latoya English, Joseph Maldonado, Nefertiti, Cynthia from the lab program, and all the Connect staff, and all of you for spending your evening with us. So give yourselves a round of applause. And thank you to our panelists. And so I know people wanted to ask questions, but if you look on the board here, we have Twitter handles, and I'm going to ask the panelists to spend some time in answering any questions that you all have from the audience, to spend a few hours over the next couple of days to answer any questions that you may have, including myself. I dedicate time to responding to you on social media. So please follow all the organizations, reach out to us through email or through Twitter or Facebook. Thank you very much.